The autumn air was crisp in Oakland, California, as 18-year-old Clint Eastwood walked through the hallways of Oakland Technical High School. It was October 1948, and the leaves outside were turning golden brown. Clint was tall for his age, standing over 6 feet with broad shoulders that made him look older than his classmates. But despite his size, he had a quiet way about him that made people hardly notice he was there. Most students at Oakland Tech knew Clint as the guy who sat in the back of every classroom. He never raised his hand to answer questions, even when he clearly knew the answers. During lunch, while other kids gathered in loud groups, Clint would find a quiet corner to eat his sandwich alone or with his one close friend, Jake Miller. Jake was different from Clint. He was shorter, more talkative, and always trying to get Clint to come out of his shell. The two had become friends when Jake moved to Oakland from San Francisco the year before. Jake's family had more money than most, and his father owned a small business downtown. But Jake never acted like he was better than anyone else, which is probably why he and Clint got along so well. On this particular Tuesday morning, Clint was sitting in his usual spot in the back row of the school auditorium. The annual talent show was only 2 weeks away, and students were using the space to practice their acts during their free periods. Clint watched as Betty Collins, a popular girl from his English class, practiced her dance routine on the wooden stage. Betty moved gracefully across the stage, her red hair catching the light from the old stage lamps. She was one of those students who seemed to excel at everything. She got good grades, was friendly to everyone, and now she was preparing what looked like a professional dance number for the talent show. "She's really good," Jake whispered to Clint as they sat watching from the back rows. Clint nodded but said nothing. He had learned early in life that it was often better to observe than to speak. His family had moved around a lot when he was younger. His father, Clinton Sr., had worked various jobs that required them to relocate frequently. By the time they settled in Oakland, Clint had attended several different schools. Each move had taught him that it was easier to stay quiet and blend into the background than to try to make new friends who he might have to leave behind. The auditorium door creaked open, and more students filed in to watch the rehearsals or practice their own acts. There was Danny Walsh, the star of the football team, who was planning to do a comedy routine. Danny was the kind of student who commanded attention wherever he went. He had perfectly styled dark hair, a confident smile, and the easy charm that made teachers and students alike gravitate toward him. Behind Danny came Lisa Martin, a girl with kind eyes and brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Lisa was known for her sweet voice and was preparing to sing a popular song from the radio. She had been in the school choir since freshman year and had a reputation for being genuinely nice to everyone, even the quieter students like Clint. "Look at all these talented people," Jake said, nudging Clint with his elbow. "You know, you should really think about signing up for the talent show." Clint shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't have any talents worth showing off," he replied, quietly. Jake turned to look at his friend with surprise. "Are you kidding me? What about your piano playing? I've heard you at your house, Clint. You're incredible." The truth was that Clint had been playing piano since he was 7 years old. His mother, Ruth, had insisted on lessons when she noticed his natural ear for music. Even during their frequent moves, she had always made sure there was access to a piano for Clint to practice. She would often tell him that music was something no one could ever take away from him, no matter where life led them. At home, Clint would spend hours at the old upright piano in their modest living room. He started with simple songs his mother taught him, but as he grew older, he began to experiment with more complex pieces. He particularly loved jazz music, with its intricate rhythms and emotional depth. When he played, something changed in him. The quiet, reserved teenager would disappear, replaced by someone confident and expressive. But that was in the privacy of his own home. The thought of playing in front of his classmates, in front of the entire school, made his stomach turn with anxiety. "Nobody wants to hear me play piano," Clint said, trying to end the conversation. "That's not true," Jake insisted. "You have a real gift, Clint. I've never heard anyone our age play like you do." On the stage, Betty finished her routine and took a small bow to the scattered applause from the students watching. She gathered her things and walked down the aisle, passing by Clint and Jake's row. "Hi, Jake. Hi, Clint," she said with a friendly smile. "Are either of you planning to audition for the talent show?" "I keep trying to convince Clint here to sign up," Jake said before Clint could answer. "He plays piano like a professional." Clint felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. "Jake, stop," he muttered. Betty's eyes lit up with interest. "Really, that's wonderful. We could use more musical acts. Most people are doing comedy or dance routines." "See?" Jake said triumphantly. "Even Betty thinks you should do it." After Betty walked away, Clint remained quiet for the rest of the rehearsal period. He watched as other students took the stage to practice their acts. There was Tom Bradley, doing magic tricks that were honestly not very impressive. Sarah Johnson was reciting a dramatic poem with gestures that seemed too big for the small auditorium. Even quiet students like Robert Kim were getting up to perform, though Robert's juggling act needed a lot more practice. As Clint watched his classmates, he realized that none of them were professional performers. They were just regular high school students willing to get up on stage and share something they enjoyed doing. Some were more polished than others, but they all had one thing in common. They were brave enough to try. Walking home from school that afternoon, Clint thought about what Jake had said. He passed by Thompson's music store on Main Street and stopped to look in the window. There was a beautiful black piano displayed prominently, its keys gleaming under the store lights. For a moment he imagined himself sitting at that bench, playing for an appreciative audience instead of just for his bedroom walls. But then reality set in. He was just Clint Eastwood, the tall, quiet kid from the back of the classroom. He wasn't a performer like Danny Walsh or Betty Collins. He was someone who preferred to watch rather than be watched. That evening at dinner, his mother Ruth noticed he was more quiet than usual, which was saying something for Clint. "How was school today, honey?" she asked as she passed him the mashed potatoes. "Fine," Clint replied, but Ruth knew her son well enough to sense there was more to the story. After dinner, as was his habit, Clint sat down at the family piano. He began playing a gentle jazz melody, his fingers moving naturally across the keys. The music filled their small house, and Ruth smiled as she listened from the kitchen while washing dishes. She had always known her son had a special gift for music, but she also knew he was too modest and shy to fully embrace it. Ruth hoped that someday Clint would find the courage to share his beautiful music with the world beyond their living room walls. As Clint played, he found himself thinking again about the talent show. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows and show people what he could do. But the thought still terrified him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning arrived gray and cloudy, typical for an October day in Oakland. Clint walked to school with the same quiet steps he always took, but his mind was still turning over yesterday's conversation with Jake. The idea of performing at the talent show kept creeping into his thoughts even though he tried to push it away. Oakland Technical High School buzzed with its usual morning energy. Students gathered in small groups near their lockers talking loudly about homework, weekend plans, and the upcoming talent show. Clint made his way to his locker, hoping to avoid any more conversations about his musical abilities. But Jake had other plans. "Morning, Clint," Jake said, appearing beside him with a grin that meant trouble. "I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday." "Jake, please don't start again," Clint said, fumbling with his combination lock. "Just hear me out," Jake continued. "I talked to my older sister Mary last night. She graduated from Oakland Tech 3 years ago, and she said the talent show was always one of the best nights of the whole school year. People still talk about some of the performances." Clint pulled out his books for first period English. "That's nice, but it doesn't change anything." "It should change everything," Jake said, lowering his voice as other students passed by. "Clint, you have something special. I've never heard anyone play piano the way you do. It's like the music just flows out of you naturally." Before Clint could respond, the warning bell rang, and they had to hurry to their first class. Mrs. Helen Adams taught English in room 204, a sunny classroom on the second floor overlooking the school's small courtyard. Mrs. Adams was in her 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been teaching at Oakland Tech for 15 years and had a reputation for really caring about her students. As the students settled into their seats, Mrs. Adams stood at the front of the classroom with a slight smile on her face. "Good morning, class," she said. "Before we begin today's lesson on poetry, I want to talk about something else. How many of you are planning to participate in the talent show next week?" Several hands went up around the room. Betty Collins raised her hand confidently, as did Lisa Martin. A few other students who Clint didn't know well also volunteered that they would be performing. "Wonderful," Mrs. Adams said. "For those of you who haven't signed up yet, I want you to think about what you have to offer. Everyone has some kind of talent or ability that makes them unique. Sometimes we just need the courage to share it with others." Her eyes seemed to rest on Clint for just a moment longer than the other students. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and looked down at his notebook. Poetry, like music and dance and all the arts, is about expressing something true about ourselves. Mrs. Adams continued. "The poets we'll study today weren't afraid to share their deepest thoughts and feelings with the world. They understood that vulnerability can be a form of strength." The class spent the next 40 minutes discussing different poems, but Clint found it hard to concentrate. Mrs. Adams' words about vulnerability and courage kept echoing in his mind. After English class, Clint walked slowly toward his locker, hoping to have a few quiet minutes before his next class. But as he turned the corner into the main hallway, he nearly walked into Danny Walsh. Danny was surrounded by his usual group of friends from the football team. They were all laughing about something, and their voices echoed off the walls of the crowded hallway. Danny was the kind of person who seemed to take up more space than his actual size would suggest. He had an energy that drew attention, and he clearly enjoyed being the center of that attention. Well, Danny said, noticing Clint. "If it isn't our mysterious piano man." Clint's heart sank. Somehow word had gotten around about his conversation with Jake and Betty yesterday. "I heard through the grapevine that you think you can play piano," Danny continued, his voice loud enough that other students began to stop and listen. "That's interesting news about quiet old Clint Eastwood." "It's not a big deal," Clint said, quietly, trying to step around Danny and his friends. But Danny wasn't finished. "Oh, I think it is a big deal," he said, blocking Clint's path. "See, I've been going to school with you for 4 years, and I've never seen you do anything except sit in the back of classrooms and keep your mouth shut. Now suddenly everyone's talking about how talented you are." More students were gathering now, sensing some kind of confrontation. Clint felt his face growing hot with embarrassment. This was exactly the kind of attention he had spent his whole life trying to avoid. "Maybe he's just shy," said a voice from the growing crowd. It was Lisa Martin, her brown eyes showing concern for Clint's obvious discomfort. "Shy is one thing," Danny said with a smirk. "But claiming to have talents you can't back up is something else entirely." "I never claimed anything," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well then, here's your chance to prove it," Danny said, his voice taking on a challenging tone. "The talent show sign-up sheet is right there on the bulletin board. If you're really as good as people say, put your name down and show us what you've got." The hallway had grown quiet except for the sound of Danny's challenge hanging in the air. Clint looked around at the faces staring at him. Some looked curious. Others seemed to be waiting for entertainment. A few, like Lisa Martin and Jake Miller, who had just arrived, looked genuinely concerned for him. "Come on, Danny," Lisa said. "Leave him alone. Not everyone needs to prove themselves to you." But something in Danny's words had struck a nerve deep inside Clint. It wasn't just the challenge or the embarrassment. It was the assumption that he was all talk and no substance. The suggestion that he was somehow fake or pretending to be something he wasn't. For 18 years, Clint had lived his life trying not to draw attention to himself. He had moved from town to town, school to school, always staying in the background. He had watched other people take risks and put themselves out there while he remained safely invisible. But he wasn't fake. His love of music was real. His ability to play piano was real. The hours he had spent practicing, the joy he felt when he sat at the keys, the way music seemed to speak through his fingers, all of that was completely real. "Fine," Clint said, his voice suddenly stronger than it had been all morning. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. "Fine what?" Danny asked, clearly not expecting this response. "I'll do it," Clint said, walking toward the bulletin board where the talent show sign-up sheet hung. "I'll sign up for the talent show." The hallway erupted in whispers and excited chatter. Jake Miller broke into a huge grin and gave Clint a supportive pat on the back. Lisa Martin smiled with genuine approval. Even some of the students who barely knew Clint seemed impressed by his sudden show of courage. Danny Walsh, for his part, looked a bit surprised that his challenge had actually worked. "Well, well," he said. "I guess we'll see what you're really made of then." As Clint picked up the pen attached to the clipboard, his hand trembled slightly. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him as he wrote his name on the list. Clint Eastwood, piano performance. The moment he finished writing, the bell rang for second period, and the crowd began to disperse. Students hurried off to their next classes, already spreading the news that the quiet kid from the back row had signed up to perform. Jake stayed behind as the hallway emptied. "I can't believe you actually did it," he said, his excitement obvious. "Neither can I," Clint admitted, staring at his name on the sign-up sheet. "Are you okay? You look a little pale." Clint took a deep breath. "I think I just made either the best decision or the worst mistake of my life." "It's going to be the best decision," Jake said confidently. "Trust me on this one." As they walked to their next class, Clint wondered if Jake was right. In just 1 week, he would have to stand on that stage in front of the entire school and prove that he was more than just the quiet kid in the back row. The thought terrified him, but somewhere deep inside, a small part of him was also excited. For the first time in his life, Clint Eastwood had taken a real risk. Whether it would pay off remained to be seen. The news of Clint Eastwood signing up for the talent show spread through Oakland Technical High School like wildfire. By the end of the day, it seemed like everyone had heard about the quiet kid who had finally accepted Danny Walsh's challenge. Some students were genuinely excited to see what Clint could do, while others seemed to be expecting some kind of disaster. Clint spent the rest of that day in a daze. During his classes, he found it impossible to concentrate on math problems or history lessons. His mind kept drifting to the image of himself sitting at a piano on stage, with hundreds of eyes watching his every move. The thought made his palms sweat, and his stomach feel like it was tied in knots. When the final bell rang, most students rushed out of the building, eager to start their afternoon activities or head home. But Clint walked slowly toward the auditorium. He needed to see the piano he would be playing on, to get a feel for the space where he would soon have to perform. The auditorium was mostly empty when he pushed open the heavy doors. A few students were still on stage practicing their acts. He could see Tom Bradley working on his magic tricks in one corner, while Sarah Johnson practiced her dramatic poem reading near the front of the stage. Clint made his way down the aisle and climbed the steps to the stage. The old upright piano sat off to one side, its dark wood showing signs of age and heavy use. He approached it carefully, as if it might bite him. "You planning to practice?" asked a voice behind him. Clint turned to see Frank Rodriguez, the school janitor, pushing a large trash can on wheels. Frank was a friendly man in his 50s who had worked at Oakland Tech for over 20 years. He had a reputation for being kind to students, especially the quieter ones who others sometimes overlooked. "I don't know," Clint said honestly. "Maybe." Frank stopped his work and walked over to the piano. "This old thing has been here since before I started working at this school," he said, running his hand along the piano's edge. "She's not the prettiest instrument in the world, but she's got good bones. The sound is still sweet if you know how to coax it out of her." "Have you heard many students play it?" Clint asked. "Oh, sure, plenty over the years," Frank said. "Most of them just bang away at it, trying to play the latest popular songs from the radio. But every once in a while, someone comes along who really understands the instrument. Those are the performances people remember." Frank opened the piano bench and pulled out some sheet music that previous students had left behind. "Why don't you give her a try? No one else is paying attention right now." Clint looked around the auditorium. The few students who were practicing were focused on their own acts, and Frank was right that no one was watching him. Maybe this would be a good chance to get familiar with the instrument he would be playing next week. He sat down on the bench and placed his fingers on the keys. The piano was slightly out of tune, but not badly so. He started with a simple scale, just to get a feel for the touch of the keys. They were a bit heavier than the piano at home, but responsive enough. As he played, Clint began to relax for the first time since he had signed up for the talent show. Music had always been his escape, the one place where he felt completely comfortable and confident. His fingers moved naturally across the keys, playing gentle melodies that seemed to flow from somewhere deep inside him. Frank had gone back to his cleaning, but Clint could see him listening as he worked. After a few minutes, the janitor stopped what he was doing and walked back over to the piano. "Son, that's beautiful," Frank said quietly. "You play with real feeling. That's not something you can learn from a book." "Thank you," Clint said, feeling his cheeks warm with the compliment. "What are you planning to play for the talent show?" Frank asked. Clint had been thinking about this question for hours. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe something by Duke Ellington. Jazz is what I really love to play." Frank nodded approvingly. "Jazz is good. It shows personality. These kids today, they all want to play the same popular songs they hear on the radio. But jazz, that's something special. That's music with soul." As they talked, neither of them noticed that the other students on stage had stopped their practicing and were listening to their conversation. Tom Bradley had put down his magic cards, and Sarah Johnson had stopped reciting her poem. Even a few students who had been walking through the auditorium had paused to listen to Clint playing. "Play something else," Frank encouraged. "Don't mind us. Just play what feels right." Clint nodded and began playing a slow, bluesy melody. It was a song he had learned from listening to jazz records, but he had added his own touches to it over the months of practice at home. As he played, he forgot about the talent show, forgot about Danny Walsh's challenge, forgot about everything except the music flowing through his fingers. The song built gradually, starting soft and gentle, then growing more complex and emotional. Clint's whole body seemed to move with the rhythm, and his usually serious expression softened into something more open and alive. When he finished, the small audience that had gathered burst into spontaneous applause. Clint looked up, startled, to realize that nearly a dozen people had been listening to him play. Tom Bradley was grinning widely, and Sarah Johnson was clapping enthusiastically. "That was incredible," Sarah said, walking over to the piano. "I had no idea you could play like that." "Where did you learn to play jazz like that?" Tom asked. "That sounded professional." Clint felt overwhelmed by the positive attention. "I've been playing for a long time," he said simply. "My mother taught me when I was young, and then I just kept practicing on my own." Frank smiled proudly as if Clint were his own grandson. "I told you this boy had something special," he said to the other students. As the impromptu audience began to disperse, Clint felt a mixture of emotions. The playing had felt wonderful, natural, and right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. But the attention, even positive attention, still made him uncomfortable. He was about to close the piano and leave when the auditorium doors opened and Jake Miller walked in, followed by Lisa Martin and a few other students from their class. "There you are," Jake said, hurrying down the aisle. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I heard you were practicing and I had to come see for myself." "We heard you playing from the hallway," Lisa added. "It sounded beautiful, even from that distance." "Would you play something for us?" asked Betty Collins, who had come in with the group. "I've been curious about your music ever since Jake mentioned it yesterday." Clint hesitated. This was a larger group than the small audience that had gathered accidentally. These were his classmates, people he would have to face in class every day after the talent show was over. "Go ahead," Frank encouraged from where he stood near the back of the auditorium. "Don't be shy. These kids want to hear what you can do." Taking a deep breath, Clint positioned his hands over the keys again. This time he chose a different song, something a bit more upbeat and accessible. As he played, he tried to focus on the music itself rather than the people listening. The melody filled the auditorium, and Clint found himself getting lost in the performance once again. He could hear his classmates whispering appreciatively, but instead of making him nervous, their obvious enjoyment began to give him confidence. When he finished, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. "Clint, that was amazing," Betty said. "You're going to be the hit of the talent show." "Seriously," Lisa agreed. "I've never heard anyone our age play like that." Jake looked like he might burst with pride for his friend. "I told you guys he was incredible. Wait until you hear him at the actual show." As his classmates continued to praise his playing, Clint felt something shifting inside him. For the first time since he had signed up for the talent show, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, he could actually do this. Maybe he could get up on that stage and share his music with the entire school. The thought still scared him, but it no longer seemed impossible. Frank approached him as the other students began to leave. "You've got something special, son," the janitor said quietly. "Don't let fear keep you from sharing it with the world. That would be a real shame." As Clint walked home that evening, he felt lighter than he had in days. The practice session had reminded him why he loved music so much, and the positive response from his classmates had given him hope that maybe the talent show wouldn't be the disaster he had been imagining. For the first time since accepting Danny Walsh's challenge, Clint Eastwood began to believe that he might actually be able to pull this off. The week leading up to the talent show passed both slowly and quickly for Clint. During the day, time seemed to crawl as he sat through his regular classes, his mind constantly wandering to thoughts of the upcoming performance. But in the evenings, when he practiced at home, the hours flew by as he lost himself in the music. Every night after dinner, Clint would sit at the family piano in their small living room. His mother, Ruth, would listen from the kitchen as she cleaned up from dinner, occasionally pausing in her work to smile at a particularly beautiful melody. She noticed that her son was playing with more passion than usual, as if something inside him had been awakened. "You sound wonderful, honey," she told him on Wednesday evening as he finished practicing a complex jazz piece. "Your music has so much emotion in it lately." Clint looked up from the piano keys. "Mom, I signed up for the school talent show," he said quietly. Ruth put down the dish towel she was holding and walked into the living room. She had been hoping for years that Clint would find the courage to share his musical gift with others. "That's wonderful news," she said, sitting down on the couch nearby. "How are you feeling about it?" "Scared," Clint admitted. "Really scared. But also excited, I think. When I played at school the other day, people seemed to really like it. Frank, the janitor, said I played with feeling." Ruth smiled warmly at her son. "Frank is right. You don't just play the notes, Clint. You play from your heart. That's what makes music special." "But what if I mess up in front of everyone?" Clint asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping him awake at night. "What if I forget the song or hit the wrong keys?" His mother was quiet for a moment, thinking about her response. "Do you remember when you were 10 and we lived in that little apartment in San Francisco?" she asked. Clint nodded. That had been during one of his father's job changes, and they had lived in a cramped 2-bedroom place for 6 months. "The people in the apartment next door used to complain about your piano practicing," Ruth continued. "But there was an elderly woman who lived upstairs, Mrs. Peterson. She used to tell me that your music was the best part of her day. She said it made her feel less lonely." "I remember her," Clint said. "She used to leave cookies by our door sometimes." "That's right, and she left them because your music touched her heart." "Music isn't about being perfect, Clint. It's about sharing something beautiful with other people. Even if you hit a wrong note or two, people will remember how you made them feel, not the mistakes." That conversation with his mother helped calm some of Clint's nerves, but he still felt the pressure building as the talent show approached. At school, it seemed like everyone was talking about the upcoming event. The hallways buzzed with excitement as students discussed who they thought would win and what they expected from different performers. On Thursday, Clint was walking to his locker when he overheard a conversation that made his stomach drop. "Heard Clint Eastwood is planning to play piano," said a voice he recognized as belonging to Steve Miller, one of Danny Walsh's friends from the football team. "Really?" said another voice. "The tall, quiet kid? I didn't even know he could play." "That's what I heard," Steve continued. "Danny says he dared him to sign up. Should be interesting to see if he can actually play or if he just crashes and burns in front of everyone." The boys laughed as they walked away, not noticing that Clint had heard every word. Their casual dismissal of his abilities stung more than he expected. It reminded him that many of his classmates still saw him as nothing more than the silent kid from the back of the classroom. But their doubt also sparked something inside him. He thought about all the hours he had spent practicing, all the joy he felt when he played, all the positive reactions he had gotten from the people who had actually heard his music. Danny Walsh and his friends didn't know what he was capable of, and maybe it was time to show them. Friday arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that rattled the windows of Oakland Technical High School. The talent show was scheduled for that evening, and the entire building seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. Students who were performing walked through the hallways with distracted expressions, mentally rehearsing their acts. During lunch, Clint sat with Jake in their usual quiet corner of the cafeteria. He had barely touched his sandwich, his appetite diminished by the butterflies dancing in his stomach. "You need to eat something," Jake said, noticing his friend's untouched food. "You're going to need your energy tonight." "I'm too nervous to eat," Clint replied. "Every time I think about sitting at that piano with everyone watching, I feel sick." Jake leaned forward across the small table. "Listen to me, Clint. I've heard you play dozens of times. You're not just good, you're incredible. People are going to be blown away tonight. What if I freeze up? What if I get on stage and just can't play?" "That's not going to happen," Jake said confidently. "Music is part of who you are. When you sit down at a piano, it's like watching someone come alive. You're not going to freeze up because playing music is as natural to you as breathing." After lunch, Clint decided to skip his study hall period and go to the auditorium one more time. He wanted to practice on the actual piano he would be using that evening to make sure he felt comfortable with the instrument. The auditorium was busier than it had been earlier in the week. Several students were on stage doing final rehearsals of their acts. Mrs. Adams, who was helping to coordinate the talent show, was sitting in the front row with a clipboard, making notes about the running order and technical requirements for each performance. When she saw Clint enter, she waved him over. "Hello, Clint," she said with a warm smile. "I'm so glad to see you signed up for the show. Are you here to do a final practice?" "Yes, ma'am," Clint replied. "I just want to make sure I'm comfortable with the piano." "Of course. You're scheduled to perform fifth, right after Lisa Martin's song and before the comedy acts. That's a good spot in the program." Clint nodded, though the mention of his specific place in the lineup made the performance feel even more real and immediate. "Can I ask what you're planning to play?" Mrs. Adams asked. "A jazz piece," Clint said. "Something I've been working on for a while." Mrs. Adams' eyes lit up with interest. "How wonderful. We haven't had a jazz performance in years. I think the audience will really appreciate something different." When his turn came to practice, Clint walked onto the stage with legs that felt slightly unsteady. The auditorium looked enormous from up there, even with only a few people scattered in the seats. He tried to imagine what it would feel like that evening when every seat was filled. He sat down at the piano bench and placed his hands on the familiar keys. For a moment, he just sat there trying to calm his racing heart. Then he began to play. The music flowed out smoothly and confidently. All his hours of practice had paid off, and his fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease. The melody filled the large space beautifully, and even the students who were waiting their turn to rehearse stopped what they were doing to listen. When he finished, Mrs. Adams started clapping enthusiastically. "That was beautiful, Clint," she called from her seat. "Absolutely beautiful. You're going to be wonderful tonight." As Clint walked off the stage, he felt a mixture of confidence and terror. The practice had gone well, better than he had hoped. But he knew that performing in front of a few people during the afternoon was very different from performing in front of the entire school that evening. Frank Rodriguez appeared beside him as he made his way toward the exit. "Sounding good, son," the janitor said with an encouraging pat on the shoulder. "You ready for tonight?" "I think so," Clint said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "You know what the secret is to performing?" Frank asked. Clint shook his head. "Don't think about the audience. Don't think about the people watching you or what they might think. Just think about the music. Let everything else disappear and focus on sharing something beautiful. That's all you have to do." As Clint walked home from school that afternoon, Frank's advice echoed in his mind. Don't think about the audience. Just think about the music. It sounded simple, but he wondered if he would be able to follow that advice when he was actually sitting on stage with hundreds of eyes watching him. The talent show was only a few hours away, and soon he would find out if all his practicing and all his courage would be enough to carry him through the most challenging moment of his young life. That evening, as Clint got dressed in his best shirt and tie, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. He looked older somehow, more serious. Tonight he was going to step out of the shadows and show his classmates who he really was. He was about to discover that sometimes the most frightening moments in life are also the most transformative. The Oakland Technical High School auditorium had been transformed for the talent show. Colorful streamers hung from the ceiling, and bright stage lights cast a warm glow over the wooden stage. By 7 o'clock that Friday evening, nearly every seat was filled with students, parents, teachers, and family members. The excited chatter of the audience created a buzz of energy that seemed to vibrate through the entire building. Backstage, in the small area behind the curtain, nervous performers paced back and forth, doing last-minute preparations for their acts. Betty Collins stretched her legs and practiced her dance moves in a corner. Tom Bradley shuffled through his deck of cards one more time, muttering the words to his magic tricks under his breath. Lisa Martin hummed quietly to herself, warming up her voice for her upcoming song. Clint stood near the back wall, trying to stay out of everyone's way. He wore his best white shirt, a dark blue tie that his mother had picked out, and black pants that she had pressed especially for the occasion. His hair was neatly combed, and he looked more polished than most of his classmates had ever seen him. But inside, his stomach felt like it was doing gymnastics. His palms were sweaty, and he kept wiping them on his pants. Every few minutes, he would peek through a small gap in the curtain to look at the audience. The auditorium seemed to be getting fuller by the minute, and the sight of all those faces made his heart beat even faster. "Places, everyone?" called Mrs. Adams, who was serving as the backstage coordinator for the evening. "We're about to begin." The first act was a group of 3 girls who performed a synchronized dance routine to a popular song from the radio. They moved across the stage with practiced precision, their colorful dresses swirling under the stage lights. The audience clapped along with the music, and when the girls finished, they received enthusiastic applause. Next came a boy named Carl Peterson, who told jokes that made some people laugh and others groan. His comedy routine was followed by Tom Bradley's magic act, which went better than his practice sessions had suggested. Tom managed to pull off several card tricks without dropping anything, and the audience seemed genuinely impressed. Lisa Martin was the 4th performer, and her sweet voice filled the auditorium as she sang a ballad that many people in the audience recognized. She hit every note perfectly, and when she finished, the applause was warm and appreciative. Then Mrs. Adams walked onto the stage to introduce the next act. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "our next performer is Clint Eastwood, who will be playing piano for us this evening." The mention of Clint's name caused a ripple of whispers to spread through the audience. Many people had heard rumors about the quiet student's musical abilities, but most had never actually heard him play. In the 3rd row, Danny Walsh sat with his arms crossed, a skeptical expression on his face as he waited to see if Clint could back up the claims that had been made about his talent. Backstage, Clint felt his legs turn to jelly at the sound of his name. This was it. There was no turning back now. Frank Rodriguez, who had been helping with the stage setup, appeared beside him. "You remember what I told you?" Frank asked quietly. Clint nodded, though he wasn't sure he could speak. "Don't think about them," Frank said, gesturing toward the audience. "Just think about the music. Let everything else disappear." Taking the deepest breath of his life, Clint walked out onto the stage. The auditorium fell completely silent as he made his way to the piano. Under the bright stage lights, he looked taller and more serious than usual. His long stride carried him across the stage with a confidence that surprised many people in the audience, including himself. He sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, just as he had practiced. For a moment, he looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. He could see his mother Ruth in the 5th row, her eyes shining with pride and encouragement. Jake Miller sat nearby, giving him a thumbs up. Even some of the teachers were watching with obvious interest. But he could also see Danny Walsh and his friends, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail spectacularly. The thought of their potential mockery made his hands tremble slightly as he placed them on the keys. Then he remembered Frank's advice. Don't think about the audience. Just think about the music. Clint closed his eyes for a brief moment, took another deep breath, and hit the first note. What happened next was nothing like what anyone in the audience had expected. Instead of a tentative amateur performance, rich and complex jazz melodies began to flow from the old upright piano. Clint's fingers moved across the keys with a skill and confidence that seemed to belong to someone much older and more experienced. The song he had chosen was a jazz standard, but he had arranged it in his own unique way. It started quietly and gently, with soft, contemplative notes that drew the audience in. But as the piece progressed, it grew more complex and emotionally powerful. Clint's whole body seemed to move with the rhythm of the music, and his usually reserved expression gave way to something more open and alive. In the audience, people sat transfixed. This was not the nervous, stumbling performance they had been, half expecting from the quiet kid in the back of their classrooms. This was the work of a true musician, someone who understood music not just as notes on a page, but as a language for expressing deep emotions. Ruth Eastwood wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son share his gift with the world. All those years of encouraging him to practice, all those evenings of listening to him play in their living room, had led to this moment. She could see that he was no longer the shy teenager who had walked onto the stage. The music had transformed him into someone confident and powerful. Jake Miller sat with his mouth hanging open, amazed by his friend's performance even though he had heard Clint play many times before. There was something different about tonight, something more passionate and alive than he had ever heard from Clint's playing. Even Danny Walsh's skeptical expression had changed to one of genuine surprise and respect. He had expected to be entertained by an embarrassing failure, but instead he was witnessing real talent. The cocky smile had disappeared from his face, replaced by the kind of attention that people give to something truly impressive. As the piece reached its climax, Clint's playing became even more intense and emotional. His fingers flew across the keys with precision and passion, creating music that seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. The complex jazz rhythms built to a powerful crescendo that left the audience holding its breath. Then gradually, the music began to wind down. Returning to the gentle, contemplative mood of the opening, Clint played the final notes with a tenderness that seemed to caress each key. When the last note faded into silence, the auditorium remained quiet for several seconds, as if the audience was reluctant to break the spell that had been cast by the beautiful music. Then the applause began. It started as a scattered clapping from different parts of the auditorium, but quickly grew into something much more powerful. People began to stand up one by one until nearly the entire audience was on its feet, giving Clint a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Clint sat at the piano bench, stunned by the response. He had never experienced anything like this before. The audience was not just clapping politely, they were genuinely moved by what they had heard. The shy, invisible teenager had disappeared completely, replaced by someone who had just commanded the attention and respect of hundreds of people through the power of his music. As he stood up from the piano bench, Clint felt like a completely different person than the one who had walked onto the stage just a few minutes earlier. He had faced his greatest fear and discovered that he was capable of much more than he had ever imagined. The applause continued as he walked off the stage, and he could hear people calling out compliments and words of amazement. Backstage, the other performers crowded around him with congratulations and expressions of awe. "That was incredible," Betty Collins said, shaking her head in amazement. "I had no idea you could play like that." "Where did you learn to play jazz like that?" asked Tom Bradley. Even Mrs. Adams appeared backstage with tears in her eyes. "Clint, that was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard in all my years of teaching," she said. But the moment that meant the most to Clint came when Danny Walsh appeared backstage. The football star who had issued the original challenge walked up to Clint with a completely different expression than he had worn earlier in the week. "I owe you an apology," Danny said, extending his hand for a handshake. "That was amazing. I had no idea what you were capable of." As Clint shook Danny's hand, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his life. He was no longer the invisible kid who sat in the back of classrooms. He had found his voice, and he had discovered that when he shared his true talents with the world, people responded with appreciation and respect. The talent show continued with several more acts, but everyone agreed later that Clint's piano performance had been the highlight of the evening. When the judges announced the winners, Clint took first place, receiving a small trophy and a gift certificate to Thompson's music store. But the real prize was something much more valuable than any trophy. Clint Eastwood had discovered that he had the power to move people, to command attention, and to share something beautiful with the world.